due to his career in football and all the concussions he's had. And I don't blame him for having those concerns. And while he's out there, he's arguably one of the best, if not the best, middle linebacker in football when he's on the field. But when he's not out there, the Panthers defense struggles. And you can point to a number of games over his career where they lost simply because he wasn't playing, and basically nothing else. So I get it. He loves the game. We as fans love the game, but I think somewhere along the way, we as fans in general tend to lose sight over how damaging this game is to these players' bodies and their minds. Because when they walk away from the game, they still have these aches, these bruises, these pains, the effects of what this game does to their bodies. They have to live with that for the rest of their lives. I mean, no one walks away from football perfectly healthy. Even the greats, no matter how good they look, it's like, oh, they look like they can still play. Pretty sure some of them don't want to put pads back on and go back through that torture on their body anymore, because there's definitely an element that they have that they're not, publicly highlighting, saying like, oh yeah, this is still bothering me, or it hurts when I get up in the morning, or sometimes I'm a little woozy. I mean, I point to Jim Kelly. And, his throat and jaw cancer aside, he mentioned that pretty much the first couple of years after he was done playing, he'd wake up and not know where he was, or sometimes who he was, because of the number of concussions he had. And he played in the era where you get your bell rung, quote unquote. You sit out for a play, get the smelling salts. What day is it? Sunday. All right, we're sending you back in. You're perfectly okay. And that was an era in which that's what you were supposed to do. And we're still learning about the effects of concussions and repeated, collisions in this game. Look, between middle linebackers, quarterbacks, offensive and defensive linemen, I feel for those guys the most. Those are the positions that are constantly in contact with another body on every single play, regardless of what happens.
Did you mention fullbacks there? Because I think this is an underreported retirement. Zach Line, the fullback for the New Orleans Saints, also announced his retirement after only 8 years in the NFL.
And, I would love to mention fullbacks, but unfortunately it's a position in the game that's slowly going extinct until this season, because of how many teams led the league at the top of the league in rushing made the playoffs. Banging into the line, but, the Saints really don't use line that much in two-back sets, especially when they're running the football. It was Kamara and Murray, and sometimes Kamara was just split out wide while Murray was in the backfield. Fullbacks bang into the line. Sometimes they catch those flat routes on the goal line and play action. I'm pretty sure he's taking his fair share of banging. Plus, he plays special teams, which is basically just a collision waiting to happen every single time, whether it's punt return, kickoff, or kickoff return. So he's always banging into somebody at least 5 times a game, minimum. So, look, just the sport in general is it's a collision sport for a reason. It's not a contact sport. It's a collision sport. And former athletes mention that all the time.
Former athletes will tell you about special teams. It's like, go out there, stare up into the sky, and wait 5 seconds for a ball to come out of it, and then run through the traffic on the highway. That's what playing special teams is. That's crazy. The one retirement that's probably not a surprise is he retired once before, and he ended up playing 2 more seasons after that first retirement. And that's Antonio Gates, who finally has said, that's it, I'm done. But I leave the league as the leading touchdown scorer for tight ends in the history of the sport. Antonio Gates, certainly a Hall of Famer.
Absolutely. You're talking about an era where pretty much the top 2 tight ends in the league were either he or Antonio Gonzalez, and he came back due to injury at the tight end position for the Chargers to help solidify that position for them. Knew he played last year, didn't know he was on a roster this year with the Chargers.
I think it was hurt for a lot of this year.
That may be why. Yeah, but, congrats to him stepping away, hopefully for good this time. I don't think the Chargers can pry him back out of retirement again. They get injuries to that position, they'll have to look elsewhere, practice squad, cast off some other teams or maybe their own. But, definitely a Hall of Famer, depending on who he's up against, might not be first ballot.
No, may not be. Speaking of the Hall of Fame, I don't want to get too much into this one, just because we can talk about the Hall of Fame forever. We're going to have our disagreements, and there's nothing that we can do now to change it. But first of all, the whole idea of this bogus Centennial ballot where 15 extra guys are getting into the Hall of Fame this year because they've been out of the league for a while and they've been on the ballot and they just haven't had their opportunity, and now they're getting in. For instance, Bill Cowher and Jimmy Johnson making it in as coaches, probably out of the list of the coaching candidates that they could have put in that were finalists on this Centennial ballot. They're probably the most deserving. However, Don Coryell was on that list. And again, perhaps Coryell's record is not doing him any favors. It's not even a perhaps. It's clearly it's not doing him any favors. But the game we watch today, the game of football that you all enjoy right now today, is thanks to Don Coryell. Like, that offense didn't exist prior to Don Coryell. It didn't. People would throw the ball, but they didn't throw it the way that they throw it now, and that's Don Coryell. And that's why he belongs in the game. If he's got to get in as a contributor, if he's got to get in, he has to be represented somehow in that Hall of Fame. And I guess you could look at Dan Fouts as being the Don Coryell representative because he is a Hall of Famer.
Yeah.
I just don't understand how the quarterback behind the offense is in, but the mind behind the offense isn't in. Similarly, and I'm a Patriots fan, so I have no connection whatsoever to this particular player. But if you make an all-decades team, you've been voted onto an all-decade team. You are one of the best players of a decade. How are you not in the Hall of Fame? Drew Pearson? I don't get it. And Drew Pearson will rightfully showed his frustration. It was caught on camera and it's been spread on social media like crazy. He absolutely should be in the Hall. I get it. Listen, the 70s were not what the game is now in the 2000s. His stats aren't going to compare to Randy Moss, Terrell Owens, all of those guys. But he was on the all-decade team of the 70s. Not second team, not third team, first team. 100% should be a Hall of Famer.
And I think this came down between – I think this is a case where it came down between him and the other receiver on that all-70s decade team, Harry Carmichael. And
why is Harry Carmichael in? Why is Harry Carmichael in? What has he done?
Look, I got nothing. Arguably, probably the best receiver in Eagles history. He is on the all-70s decade team as well with Drew Pearson, first team, mind you. But I think they probably chose one receiver. I don't know how they came to the decision of Carmichael over Pearson. I'm not even trying to cape up for Carmichael. I just don't understand. First of all, anytime if you make the all-decade first team for your era, you deserve to go in the Hall of Fame. That should just be like an expressway to the Hall of Fame. The fact that Drew Pearson still isn't in to this point is crazy. And you could have put in two wide receivers if that was the case, where you were waffling on, well, we got to put on one. No, you can put in two because there's some guys on this Centennial list that I'm not really too big on actually going into the Hall of Fame.
I'm not big on Cowher and Jimmy Johnson going into the Hall of Fame, quite honestly.
Let's put it this way. If I had to choose between the two of them, Johnson over Cowher, because Johnson was there for the turnaround of that team as far as how they basically tore that team down to nothing and built it back up. And he was the head coach of those first 2 of 3 Super Bowls they would eventually win. I mean, remember, he was the coach of that team. He organized what is called the Great Trade Robbery, where he basically turned Herschel Walker into, four future Hall of Famers, if you will. You know, the myriad of draft picks they got, because if you've seen the documentary on how that trade played out and the players they ended up getting back from Minnesota for that trade, to get picks for those players, he had to cut these players. But he couldn't tell the Vikings that he was going to cut these players. And every time he cut these players, it turned into a compensatory pick. So ultimately for Herschel Walker, they didn't just get 6 or 7 picks. No, this turns into 15 to 20 picks they got for one player because of all the players they had to cut in return. And then to go 1-15 and 3 years later win, back-to-back Super Bowls. Yeah, I'd take Jimmy Johnson over Bill Cowher, because as much as we had discussions on this podcast where my contemporaries representing other teams will clearly dog Mike Tomlin, this is the case we want to use to say that Mike Tomlin is a Hall of Fame coach, because Bill Cowher is now in the Hall of Fame. And there's nothing they're going to be able to use against me to combat that, because Cowher and Tomlin's careers are identical. Cowher,
well, I'll combat you. Bill Cowher doesn't belong in the Hall of Fame. That's
fine. If that's the argument you want to make, cool. If you want to say Cowher doesn't belong in the Hall of Fame, I will end it right there. But if I bring up Tomlin deserves to be in the Hall of Fame, and I use Cowher as the example, you have no comeback for that, because one, Tomlin's done better at coaching than Cowher has. The records just show that.
I mean, it's
I understand
put it this way. It's clearly a subjective. It is a subjective ranking. It is the process of how this all happens is, I would say, less than ideal. And
no, the process was probably more ideal than we're giving them credit for. But at the same time, I look at it as all these guys who they missed the boat on putting into the Hall of Fame, and because the era of football has shifted from when these guys were all-time greats, they're getting sidetracked because players have better stats or perform better, and because the game is vastly different from when these guys played. As you mentioned, look at Pearson and even Carmichael. There's no way these guys would have made it into the Hall of Fame based on the numbers receivers are putting them down. We live in a recency bias, as far as the past decade or two, as far as what receivers have done. I mean, look, as great as Jerry Rice is, we don't believe that any receiver playing right now is going to approach his numbers as far as receptions, yards, and touchdowns.
Whenever you limit the number of candidates that you can put in, you're going to run into this problem. I don't get why you limit the number of candidates. If they're worthy of being in the Hall of Fame, you put them in the Hall of Fame. You don't go, well, sorry, we can only put 5 guys in this year. You're not going to make the list. So then it keeps getting pushed back. And like you said, you push until ultimately there's a whole new group of candidates from a completely different era of football that completely overshadow anything that you did in your era. And I think that's exactly what's happened to Don Coryell. And there's just recency bias with the NFL Hall of Fame. But it's not even the NFL Hall of Fame. It's the Pro Football Hall of Fame.
Pro Football Hall of Fame, right.
So I can't wait. I can't wait for those AAF players in 5 years when they're available to be put in.
Hilarious. But Jay, just look at some of the names here that were put in, that we didn't talk about. Bears tackle Jim Covert, Packers defensive back Bobby Dillon, Jets tackle Winston Hill, Lions defensive tackle Alex Karras, Chicago Cardinals tackle Duke Slater, Cleveland Browns wide receiver Max Speedy, who you could argue Drew Pearson should be in over him.
My question is Alex Karras going to be inducted by Webster? That's what I want to know.
Okay, first, that hurt. Emmanuel Lewis is no longer with us.
Oh, no, I didn't realize. My goodness.
That's wrong, man.
R.I.P. Emmanuel Lewis. When did he pass?
Years ago, guy.
Are you serious?
Yes.
No.
Yes.
Oh, this is terrible. Terrible.